Today we are looking at the Roman Republic. We're actually going to talk about the Roman Kingdom just briefly because there's not a whole lot there. And then we're going to be looking at the Republic, which is really kind of broken up into two periods: the early Republic and then the later Republic, which is divided between the Punic Wars. So just to get a sense of time frame, you have the Kingdom period, which was from 753 to 509 BCE. Now, there have been some reports that the kingdom might have been earlier than that, but this has been the standard date. And the newer reports, certainly might shed some light on a slightly earlier date for that, but this is usually the standardized time frame. Then you have the Republic. And the Republic period is from 509 to either 31 or 27 BCE. The split date is because there is argument. If you're being safe with the date, you'd probably put 27 BCE. There's two events that happened. 31 is the Battle of Actium, which was against Octavian and Mark Antony, and some argue that the shift to the empire was with the end of that battle, and others argue that it's the 27 BCE, which is when Octavian goes back to the Republic, to Rome and to the Senate, and tries to give back his power, and they refuse and heap on a whole bunch of praises and power on him, and he becomes the official ruler of Rome. Either date works, or you can put both there. Now for the empire, so then it's 31 or 27 BCE, and then you kind of have different dates depending on when you're basically assessing when did the empire end. So if you are putting it for when Rome gets sacked, it would be 410 CE. If you were doing it earlier, you could do it around the 300s with Constantine, although it's still probably somewhat considered that. You could have done it with Diocletian, who was right before Constantine, who split the empire, although Constantine brings it back together. So 410 would be the sack of Rome. But you have the Byzantine Empire, which continues until 1453, with the fall of Constantinople. And that is the Eastern Empire of Rome. And while the Byzantine Empire gets its own title because they really evolve into a very different culture than what we're going to be looking at for the Roman Empire here, they were the descendants of Romans. So again, there's a couple different periods and dates that you could look at for that, as far as when is the true time frame for that. So we're going to be looking at the Kingdom and Republic today, and what was going on, how it was structured and developed. The first group of people we're actually going to look at for the Kingdom has to do with the so we'll put Kingdom, but under the Kingdom we're really looking at the Etruscans. The Etruscans were the rulers of the Roman Kingdom. The Etruscans controlled the area, and Rome was essentially a tributary state to the Etruscans. And we'll look at a map and some pictures in just a minute to kind of show their reach and power. The Etruscans, they do go back to the Bronze Age. So let's put first here, Rome was a tributary state. So we're clear that the Etruscans were not the Romans. Rather, the Romans were a state under the Etruscan Empire. So the Etruscans have a long history. And from that to the Bronze Age, They have a mix of Greek culture. They had contact with Assyria and Greece, and there's definitely some Greek culture influenced in what they did, and yet they also had very unique culture as well. They were also non-Indo-European speakers. So that's the background for the Etruscans. What we're going to look at is some of the influences that they provided to Rome, because one of the important things that that they did is that they provided a lot of culture and influence that Rome continued, even as they end up rejecting the Etruscan state and the idea of kings. They were influenced by Etruscan culture. They were skilled metal workers, and a lot of Rome's development with military weapons and any kind of really metal work, it was influenced from the Etruscans. They also had pretty advanced technological abilities, and this had to do with farming and irrigation. They were some of with the earliest in this area of setting up drainage and ways to farm or irrigate and water the farms efficiently. They also had early starts with arches, which Rome is going to become famous for implementing into their society and adapting further. But the early arches were really from the Etruscans. And then tools, which could go under metalwork as well, but also was they were technologically ahead in many of those cases. Another area which they were unique, and this is where they definitely didn't have Greek influence, had to be with women and their role in society. Women in the Etruscan states were of equal status, or close to, we'll say close to equal status, right, which would be the opposite of Greek culture. They were active participants in public life. So you went out in public, you participated in Etruscan society, there weren't restrictions on them. And then they were big on dinner parties, women, and well, the Etruscans in general, and the Romans for sure took influence from. What's interesting with this is that Rome's going to take some aspects of kind of women's roles into their society. One of the areas that they really take and copy for women was what they were allowed to do with dinner parties, which was participate, eat with them, engage in discussions, even political discussions in Rome where you weren't allowed to in other areas. The dinner party was kind of like fair game, and that very much was connected to Etruscan structure and value early on. Now, the last Etruscan king was Tarquin, and he was the Romans called him a tyrant, and he was influential with Roman development. He was called Tarquin the Proud, and he was both again beneficial to Rome, but also somewhat seen as cruel in certain areas. He certainly enforced rules strictly. What he did was that he brought Rome into an urban setting. If they hadn't, might have been much harder for the Republic to survive. Rome was pretty backwards when the Etruscans took them over. They were small. They were not a large metropolis. They weren't cosmopolitan. And Tarquin really brought Rome into that larger urban setting and cosmopolitan structure, which allowed them to thrive when they overthrew the Etruscans. They also, because of Tarquin and his son, which we'll see, it created a sense of kingship as evil for Rome. After the overthrow of the Etruscans, the Romans were forever well, not forever, but for most of Roman history, very, very anti-king. It's part of what's going to get Julius Caesar in trouble long term as well, is that he was seen as putting forth actions that were king-like, which of course there was a big no-no for Rome. Part of their dislike of kingship, well, almost all of their dislike of kingship, came from the Etruscan kings, and specifically Tarquin the Proud. So that's the Etruscans. Let's look at some of the images here for that. We have the Etruscan map, which you can see with their area of control, as they controlled a good chunk of what becomes Italy, at least the coastal region. They also had some further influence in southern regions. And so you had an Etruscan League, Etruscan influence, and they had states that were then underneath their control. So they controlled a good chunk of, and certainly larger than what even Rome was initially in that area. Here we have Etruscan weapons, which again has the metalwork that they were very skilled in for their time, and that the Romans then took and adapted into their own military use. And that helped make Rome a strong army. So that their early military success, especially early, now Rome's going to adapt on their own as well, but their early success was because of not only, but had a part of the fact that they had the metalwork and tools and skills that they had learned from the Etruscans. So what's interesting is a lot of the Etruscan stuff looks Romanesque because the Romans adapted it. You have here architecture and engineering, the arches that were first Etruscan that then the Romans famously adapt and utilize on their own, which of course is just a feature in architectural engineering, the ability to have the stone set into place so that it holds the weight from whatever is on top of it, even to the point that this can be not freestanding, but just the pressure alone holds the arch into place. And the arch itself is stronger than other engineering architectural techniques, so that it can actually hold more weight, which allows you to do more things with architecture in general. As far as sculptures and women, the dress, which we could see is going to look like some of the Roman toga styles, even to a degree, Roman Republic statues take this idea of individualism and showcasing the actual person, to where if you looked at it, you can say, oh, I know who that is, kind of thing. That's definitely from the Etruscan influence. Here we have, this is on top of, for burial, a sarcophagus in a way, and what you had is that this is a husband and wife, and the fact that they're showing affection, he's got his arm around her, this is more than the Romans did with women. So the Etruscans, women had more rights than the Roman women will, and we'll look at that. But they did influence some of the freedoms that Roman women had. And so the Etruscans, women were for the most part, seemed to be equal within society. There was this big emphasis on showing loving relationships with Etruscan families and women as an important part of society. So that was definitely unique to the Etruscans, but again, as I mentioned, does influence that. And then sporting events, I didn't write that one, I'll add that. Actually, early gladiator games were from the Etruscans. Now, the gladiator games were not what the Romans eventually made them to be. These were where you had races, which you see here with chariot races, mock battles, plays. So the arena for gladiator games, like right what it became with Rome, these were races, mock battles, and plays. The Romans are eventually going to make it more brutal, with more death involved in all of that. Here we'll add that to here. We'll squeeze it in. Gladiator games. The Romans make it more brutal, but that takes really until the empire, because they did, for an early republic, while there was some deaths that took place, they often did mock battles, reenactment of battles that actually took place, fights that did not end in death. So you would fight until someone gave up. And of course, there were accidents, because you would often fight with real weapons, although you didn't always have to. And this makes sense because it was very expensive to train a gladiator. And so having them always kill each other off didn't make sense. In fact, they'd often have, you maybe have one or two main battles where it could potentially go to death. But most you would fight and then someone would surrender and then it would be over. And the mock battles, people weren't meant to die most of the time. They had plays that took place in these arenas as well. And then they did have chariot races as well. And the Romans, all in the early republic, tended to copy this. Later, it's going the idea of people killing each other on a regular basis was done as a way for the emperors to maintain control and keep the populace happy. It's the whole term bread and circuses, and the idea that you can con the people into complacency by putting on these gladiator games and kind of satiating their need for blood through this sport, and that gives the emperors a pass. And the worse the emperors were, the more they kind of relied on gladiator games to keep the populace happy in the process. Okay, so that's the early Etruscans. So what we're going to look at is how it transitions to the Republic, as well as, but before that, early myths of Rome, because these were important to, just like we looked at with Greek myths with the Odyssey and the Iliad and the themes. These early myths give us a view of what themes that were important to Rome. So and there's some different time periods on these. Aeneas was created with the Aeneid later. Romulus and Remus, the rape of the Sabines and rape of Lucretia were earlier, but they all fit into these kind of themes and identity behind it. So even though Aeneas, which was a person, he was part of the story of the Aeneid. He kind of sets up the foundation of Rome. This was Rome's attempt to be connected to the Greeks. Aeneas was from Troy. So here's the thing. The Romans loved Greek culture. They hated the Greeks themselves. So they wanted to be part of that Greek culture, but not be Greek. So the Aeneid sets up their founding father, if you will, of being Trojan. That there was kind of like someone was saying, how do we connect Rome to the Greeks, but not be Greek itself? The Odyssey and the Iliad are these most famous. I know, we'll be the Trojans. Perfect. The antagonist of the Greeks, and we'll create our hero from that, and then we have that connection to Greek culture, but are not the Greeks themselves. So Aeneas was a Trojan, and near the end of the Trojan War, he was visited by the gods and told that he had a larger destiny to fulfill, and he needed to leave Troy before it was destroyed. And so he takes his wife and his elderly father with him, and they flee Troy. On their escape, what happens is that he was holding his wife's hand, but he had to carry his father because his father was too old to go fast enough, and he loses his grip on his wife's hand, and when he turns back around to find her, she's gone. And he realizes he doesn't have time to search for her, and he has to continue on because the gods have dictated this need for his greater destiny. This is going to fall into the idea of, and I'll write out all the themes separately too, but sacrifice for the good of Rome. And in many cases, all of them do this. Right, he first sacrifice is his wife, it's a long story, so I'm giving you the shortest version possible here. Another one has to do with Dido and Carthage. He, along his journeys, ends up in Carthage, and the queen there, Dido, they end up having a relationship. And he stays there for quite a while until he's reminded by the gods that you haven't fulfilled your destiny. You need to keep going on. And so then he does. And while he doesn't found the city of Rome itself, he's the grandfather of those who do. And he at least settles in the general region which Rome then becomes. So that's the first story. The second one, or at least in terms of the time period of the story, it is a later myth that's created, but the starting one as far as how it works. Then you have Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus are twin brothers, and they are the grandsons of Aeneas, although they don't know that for quite a while. So Aeneas's daughter, the story goes that her daughter was a Vestal virgin, and this was an actual religious cult in Rome. The Vestal virgins, wealthy families often put their daughters into the Vestal virgin cult, especially if you had multiple daughters. It was a way to give them some autonomy, as well as advancement. So lower wealthy families, if you were super wealthy, you wouldn't necessarily do this. The Vestal virgins are kind of in the name. You had to remain a virgin. Now, because the younger girls were often put in this at a certain age, they actually had a choice whether they wanted to stay in the religious cult or leave. If you chose to stay, then you were in it for life. So you were given a choice when you were a little bit older, because you would have younger girls placed into this by their families. If you were caught not being a virgin anymore, you were buried alive. So there was a very harsh punishment for not being a virgin in this cult. It's in the title, so you can see the importance of that, right? So his daughter in the myth gets pregnant by a god. So kind of not her fault. Nonetheless, she hides it because she's a Vestal virgin, and the whole being buried alive kind of seems like a bum deal. So this should also sound familiar in terms of stories and myths that we've looked at, is that they are put into a basket, basically, and floated down the river. Right, and we saw this with Sargon and the story of Moses. So it's a constant theme, if you will. So in hopes of not only keeping her secret, but saving their lives, a poor farmer finds them and raises them until they figure out their heritage. So they eventually, right, just like everyone else, figure out who they are. And once they realize that they're the grandsons of Aeneas, they decide to found the city of Rome. And the story goes that after they had started building the city of Rome, they agreed to build the wall of Rome, and each brother took a side. And and I don't remember which, Romulus or Remus, one of them went over to the other and started making fun of how short their wall was, and pointed that out by jumping over the wall back and forth. They got into an argument and fight, and Romulus kills Remus, which is then where you get, right, Rome. So Romulus kills Remus. That's that story. And well, again, I'll talk about the themes all together. The next one connects to the story of Romulus with the rape of the Sabines. The Sabines were a neighboring group to the city of Rome, right? So the city of Rome is founded now, and the Sabines were neighbors. And Rome had a problem. They had this backwards kind of city at this point. It's always described as pretty sad and small, but it's mostly made up of men. Well, if they want Rome to succeed, right, Rome needs women. And so they go to a whole bunch of people and say, hey, do you want to make an alliance with us? Your daughters will become Roman citizens. How great is that? And everyone kind of laughs at them and is like, yeah, no, you guys are like a tiny podunk town. Like, why would we want to align with you? No thanks. So finally they're like, okay, no one wants to be a Roman. So they go to the Sabines and they invite them to a party. And they say, hey, why don't you come to this party with us? And when they're there, they drug the fathers and they kidnapped their daughters. Now, Livy, who is a Roman historian, later wrote about this myth and tried to proclaim that the rape of the Sabines in the title doesn't mean they were actually raped. It's the kidnapping. But, you know, it probably was more the first. But it is interesting that one of the Roman historians attempted to essentially mitigate the violence of said first thing within this story. And so they kidnap the daughters, and they become, so the Sabine women become Roman women. So for the Sabine women essentially are forced to marry the Roman men so that they can have Roman children. Now, apparently the Sabine fathers, you know, who knows why they take so long. They must not have cared that much in this story. I mean, it's a myth, so right. But the Sabine fathers take like 1.5 to 2 years to come back to try to get their daughters back. So 1.5 to 2 years after, you know, being drugged and their daughters being kidnapped, they're finally like, we're here, we made it. And the Roman men and the Sabine men are about to go to war. And in the story, the Sabine, now Roman women with their young babies and toddlers, hold their children and step in between the middle of their husbands and their fathers and stop the war and say, we don't want you fighting, fathers. We're Roman women now. We have our children. We want you to be friends. And so the women actually prevent war between the Sabine men and Roman men. Right? Of course, like I said, not with counting the fact that apparently the Sabine men took their sweet, sweet time. I mean, at that point, if your father didn't come back to get you for 2 years, you'd probably be like, yeah, we're Roman now. So that's that story. And then the last one is something that historically is written down as happening, the rape of Lucretia, or at least was treated as happening by the Romans. So the other myths and stories, right, were somewhat treated like they happened too. But this one we actually have a connection to and know that this was recorded as a catalyst for the overthrow of the Etruscans. So the story with this one, so if you're looking at historically what one is more likely to have had a connection to actually happening, the rape of Lucretia is mentioned a lot in why the Romans overthrew the Etruscans. Lucretia was the wife of a wealthy Roman under the Etruscans, and the husband was out with his friends, and he was bragging that his wife was the most beautiful of all women. Oops, sorry. Keep dropping my pen during lectures. That his wife was the most beautiful out of all the women out there. And Tarquin's son, right? Tarquin was the Etruscan king or tyrant, was with this group of people and heard this story. And he decides he has to see for himself if Lucretia is the most beautiful woman out there. He shows up at the house and rapes her. She ends up telling her husband, and then ends up committing suicide. Now, the thing with, if I write and talk here, the thing with suicide and how both the Greeks and the Romans saw it is that suicide was an honorable death. So there definitely was a different mentality to suicide than today. It was something that, it was an honorable death. It was a way of taking your life into your own hands, essentially, rather than being executed or well, execution usually was the big thing with that. So to be allowed to commit suicide was seen as an honorable way to go versus someone killing you. An example of this would be with under Nero, one of the Roman emperors. He would send suicide letters, that's what they became called, to people he wanted to execute. But instead of executing them, which would be seen as shameful and potentially brand them a traitor to Rome, the suicide letters were basically like, look, you can either kill yourself, which then gives you an honorable death, or I'll execute you. And so if they committed suicide, then it was left intact with a family with honors, although it still gave Nero the right to pillage their finances and wealth, which is where many of the suicide letters, some were because he didn't like the people, but some were so he could take their wealth. Seneca was a philosopher who also was a tutor of Nero when he was younger, and he eventually got one of these suicide letters. And he was so pissed, understandably, of having to kill yourself, that he went around and smashed everything in his house that he knew Nero liked, just to spite Nero, because he knew Nero would come in after he committed suicide, because his wife ended up committing suicide. She didn't have to, but because she committed suicide with her husband, then his estate would go to Nero. And so he smashed everything that he knew Nero wanted so that he couldn't have it. But the idea is, again, that so they rallied around this story, not the fact that she told her husband and it happened, but then the Romans emphasized that her committing suicide is an honorable death to restore her honor, which of course has its own messed up idea about women and honor. That became the rallying cry of, look how virtuous and pious Lucretia is. And how horrid the Etruscans are. And that leads to the overthrow of the Etruscans and the start of the Republic. So these are really quickly, those were very short versions of these myths. So I want to look at the main points of what they represent in full, kind of the main themes, which we did with, like, so the Odyssey and Iliad before, because these do play into, we'll look at how the Romans viewed the Republic, even under Augustus, when we're going to look at the Res Gestae. he formulates that based on some of these ideals. So the first, and I wrote it with the Aeneas, was the sacrifice for the good of Rome. And in all of these stories, well, and this goes with the sacrifice for the good of Rome, that individuals have a duty to Rome, right? So it's both of those things. That you sacrifice to Rome and you have a duty to Rome itself. Aeneas sacrifices not only his wife, but his relationship with Dido, and he goes on several other journeys. They really stylize it in the same kind of thing as Odysseus, where he goes on these different journeys, and he sacrifices to get to that point, right? In Romulus and Remus, even though Romulus kills Remus, right, his brother is sacrificed for Rome. You could argue their mother sacrificed for them to survive, to establish Rome. In the rape of the Sabines, the Sabine women sacrifice by standing in between their husbands and their fathers to stop a war that could have destroyed Rome. They sacrifice in becoming Roman in many ways, even if the Romans wouldn't have seen that as a particular sacrifice. They would have seen the sacrifice as them being willing to put their duty to Rome first by standing in the middle of their fathers and their husbands to save Rome. And then Lucretia, who sacrificed through her suicide to kickstart off the overthrow of the Etruscans and the start of the Republic. The next one was Rome was destined to be great by the gods. And this will come into play with the Roman religion, especially the state religion. So the gods, right? Rome was destined to be great by the gods, and that Rome was divinely created or ordained to be, right? Because you had Aeneas being told to go off and flee Troy because he had a greater destiny, right? So ordained or created by the god, divinely ordained or created. It's that idea of that without the gods' influence, Rome never would have existed, and that the gods have a greater plan for Rome and this destiny to be great. Then you have the ideal Roman woman. Well, and real quick, right, how you see the Rome was divinely ordained or created or destined to be great. With Romulus and Remus, the fact that a god, their father was a god, and then they survived the river and all of those trials, right, that had to be God driven as well. The fact that Rome, the Sabine women accepted their place, you could argue as well. The ideal Roman woman then is one that is pious and virtuous, right? That she has piety and virtue, that she's willing to sacrifice for Rome, right? Which put under one, but that the idea of piety and virtue, both the Sabine women stepping in between their husbands and fathers, that she commits suicide, or even Romulus and Remus's mother, who sacrifices for her sons and for Rome. So in all of these cases, right, it showcases not just men sacrificing for Rome, but women sacrificing for Rome as well. And then the last one, which I didn't mention because this was the shortened version of it, was this ideal farmer soldier ideal. And the Romulus and Remus were soldiers and farmers. Aeneas was a soldier and farmer. Rome stuck to this idea that Roman citizens were both of these things, and they held on to it for a really long time, even when it wasn't the case. But the early Roman Republic, a lot of them were farmers and soldiers, and that kind of was seen as a part of the ideal Roman man. And that one's definitely more for men, right, not for women. And again, they said we'll see how they hold on to this for a very long time, even when it's no longer the case. Okay, so those are the myths, those are the themes. We're gonna come back to those and kind of reference them and look at them. We're gonna look at it in the reading that I had you do, that we're gonna take a glance at as well. So that leads us to then the Roman Republic. And with the overthrowing of the Etruscans, how they set up the Republic. Early on, you have a straight up issues and characteristics of warfare. In fact, Rome, if you're like looking at for one type of constant in a description or characteristic of Rome, it's warfare. Early on, after they overthrow the Etruscans, they are a target, and their early warfare was really defensive. They had to put up with people trying to attack them, thinking they'd be easy to take over. Later, it becomes offensive as they move to expand. And spread out, and then we'll finally see it ends with civil wars. So the Republic is really characterized by warfare. There's rarely a period that they don't have it, and that's going to shape that, especially that ideal soldier component of that was part of what Rome did. Now, for the offensive part. Once they were successful in defending their territory that they'd taken from the Etruscans, they set out to expand, and so the conquest was obviously for land, right? But it was also for gaining more people. They wanted to have more people within their society, and so they actually assimilated people early on into Roman society, where when they conquered them, what they would do is bring them into Roman society and make them Roman citizens. This becomes something that is a super valuable item that everyone wants, to the point that people would pay a ton of money for this. But the earliest conquest, those people became Roman citizens. And to be a Roman citizen gave you benefits, right? Less taxes, more legal benefits, and more likely to have wealth than elsewhere if you were what later becomes subjects of Rome, right? So the very first people became Roman citizens. Later expansion, right? The territories became subjects of Rome, and they were no longer citizens. And so then they had to pay like tributary states. They had to pay taxes. People would join the military to try to become a Roman citizen, or would pay extreme amounts, to the point that it became, to be born Roman was a sense of prestige. But the whole emphasis on assimilation definitely created this idea of people wanting to be Roman. That you had a lot of cities that were conquered or that were tributary states where the people actively tried to assimilate, to show that they wanted to be Roman, because there were so many benefits that eventually became part of Roman society. So once they had started to expand and conquer, one of the things that they also set up early on, actually even with the defensive, was of course their government structure. And early on, the structure of government was pretty simplistic. They created 2 consuls, and the consuls were the heads of state. Why 2? Well, because one looks too much like a king. And then you had the Senate, and the Senate was the ones that made the laws and the legal system and helped run the government. Then they had, it's not, we'll put it as three, but this was a temporary measure. It was the role of dictator. It was for a 6-month period, and it was only for emergencies. So much like others like Mesopotamia and some of the other societies that had this kind of structure, there was an understanding that in emergencies you needed one leader to make unilateral decisions and have all the power so that they could quickly act. But they were very explicit in the laws that it was for 6 months and it was a temporary position and only for emergencies. Once the emergency was over, right, it went back to the consuls and senate. Now, the consuls and senate were made up of patricians. There were two classes, social classes in Rome, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians, we'll put, we're going to add a couple to the government, but we'll put the social classes here because you need to know that to understand what happens with the government. The patricians were the wealthy elite. They made up a very small percentage of the Roman society. They were the nobility, right? And small percentage. Pater, patrician, comes from the Latin root pater, which means father. And then you have the plebeians, which was everyone else. And the plebeians were around 92% of the population. There's a range of a percentage that says anywhere from 2 to 8% of the population was patrician and everyone else was plebeian. So this was everyone else. The majority of the Roman population was plebeian, and it comes from the word pleb or plebe, which means multitude, right? Which makes sense because they were the majority. There is going to be a class struggle constantly in Rome. From the very beginning, this was always a problem and is going to help shape the government. Because of this, what you get, actually, I guess we'll make this 3 here. The plebeians realized that they were being taken advantage of. They largely made up the military. They were not forced to fight, but felt an obligation to do so. If certainly with the ideal of the good Roman was a farmer and a soldier. But they could not participate in the government, right? The Senate and the consuls were patrician. The early Roman Republic, the very early Roman Republic, which was at the very beginning, only had those 2 positions besides the temporary dictator part, which wasn't filled. Someone would be elected into that position. So you had those 2, the consuls and the Senate, and they were all patricians. So they could not participate in the government, but yet they were the ones that made up the majority of the military in all of these military campaigns, first for defensive and then for offensive. They had heavy taxes that they had to pay, while the patricians often got away with a whole lot less. And there were no written law codes. And the patricians had taken advantage of that by taking them to court and being able to kind of say the law was whatever they wanted. So what happens is the plebeians realize, like, hey, we actually make up the military. If we just straight up refuse to fight, there is no military. What are you going to do about it? And so they threaten to stop fighting if there isn't reform with the whole system. Oh, they often could be sold into slavery for debt too. So what they do is they essentially say, we're done. We're not going to fight anymore unless you reform stuff and put us into the government. So this all leads to reform. And that gets us back to changes in some, well, we'll look at, there's others, but that leads to changes in the government, where you're going to have a position called tribune get put into the government. Here, we'll put a line here, right, that this is the early government, very early, and after class struggle. The tribune was a representative of the plebeian people. So they were put into place by the plebeians in order to represent them. They also had some veto power over the Senate. If there was a law or legal thing that got put into place that could be argued was targeting the plebeians unfairly. So the tribunes became a champion for the plebeians in the government structure. Later, another position was added. So first it was just tribune. A little bit later, you had the Council of Plebes. The Council of Plebeians, right, were plebeians. So here is where you have a direct role in the government. And they were the ones, like the general assemblies and stuff, that were allowed to vote for laws and have some say in the structure of government. They didn't have as much as a tribune or a senator. Obviously, the Senate was where the power was. But at least they had these positions that do get added in, where they have some say. The Council of Plebes is going to later come into the Civil Wars that we're going to look at, in contesting basically Sulla and Marius. We're going to look at the Council of Plebes is going to vote one way, the Senate another, and this is going to lead to a civil war and fight in Rome. So the class struggle never goes away completely, and essentially the reform that takes place is a band-aid for these problems. So we looked at that one, right, that you have government reform. And changes there. They actually get the written law codes. These law codes were called the 12 Tables. They were kind of harsh, but what's important about them is that they were the first written law codes for Rome. So the patricians couldn't be like, oh yeah, we're in court and, you know, there's totally a law that says you have to give me all your money. And the plebeians are like, where? Oh, well, we're patricians. We know the laws. And there was no way to defend yourself. And now they did. They stole land from the plebeians. They stole money. They made up harsher punishment. So now the 12 Tables, the important part was that it was a written law code. And so that they couldn't just manipulate and make up stuff in court. They did get lower taxes. And there was laws against Roman citizens not being sold into slavery unwillingly. Roman citizens could still sell themselves if they wanted to. And occasionally they did. So if your debt got so bad that there was no way to fix it, there were cases of Romans then selling themselves into slavery to satisfy that debt. So it definitely was without their consent. Whereas before, you were just sent in. Okay, so that's the major changes. One, the class struggle, and then the major changes that took place with the social class struggle. But again, it is just a band-aid. It doesn't fix everything long term. Let's look at, I think I have a couple here. I have Romulus and Remus. Here's a statue that shows Romulus and Remus. Oh yeah, one of the things I left out in the myth is before the farmer finds them, the story goes that they were saved by a she-wolf, right? A wolf that had been pregnant, and that they drank her milk to survive until the farmer stumbled upon them. So this was really a famous story in Rome, and seen as one of their founding myths. The map here, just to showcase how much they're going to expand, we're going to talk about the Punic Wars. This red dot here is Roman territory at the beginning of the Republic, right? Which is basically Rome. The purple is these are going to be the Punic Wars. So the only thing this doesn't show is it'd be nice to showcase where they expanded to, which was a little bit more than the city of Rome itself when the Republic was initially spreading out nearby, but it wasn't very far. All of this expansion is happening with the Punic Wars, and so we'll come back to this because it is an important part of it. The Punic Wars gained them so much land, right? So you can see the tiny area of Rome, and then the purple is the first Punic War. The red is at the end of the first Punic War. The red is territory after the end of the Punic Wars, and the yellowish orange color is when Caesar dies. That's the whole territory that they have. So that there is significant expansion of the Roman Republic, which would eventually become the empire, starting from a very, very small area. And then this map I put in, it's the same showing the territory, it's just all the same color, so that when you have the end of the Roman Republic, this is the whole territory that they have. Here's Rome, right? And how far that they've conquered by the end of the Republic. Okay, so there's a couple of the things I want to look at with the Republic in culture and structure. The first is going to be religion. Religion was, you have components of Greek religion, but you also have Rome's unique structure of religious belief as well. So they did take the Greek pantheon of gods. They had the 12 Olympians. They followed that. They just simply changed the names to Latin. So they followed the main, we'll say, pantheon of Greek gods, especially the 12 Olympians were their main ones. You had two parts to Roman religion. You had the state religion, and then you had what was personal religion. So we'll look at the state religion first. The state religion was following the more traditional gods, or more traditional Greek gods, right? I mean, they called them Roman gods now, but they were definitely the Greek gods. However, they also had, those were the major deities. And remember, in polytheistic religions, you have major deities and minor deities. They also had thousands and thousands of minor gods. Now, the state religion is connected to that theme we looked at, right? That Rome was divinely appointed and destined to be great. So there became an interconnection with Roman state religion that sacrifice, because remember, in polytheistic religions, there's generally sacrifice, not of people, although there are some societies that did that. This is like animals and incense and wine and things like that. Sacrifice for the Romans then was an outward expression of loyalty, right? It was a way to visibly show that you were loyal not just to the gods, but the Roman state, because they become one and the same. The idea was that any type of ritual, festival, holiday, right, that was a religious function, was important in essentially the Romans' greatness, and we'll say the greatness of Rome. To worship the Roman gods was in effect to ensure the success of Rome. Now, this is going to showcase why, when we get to talking about Christianity in the Roman Empire, the Romans end up having such an issue with Christians. Because normally in polytheistic religions, the more the merrier. That's kind of how it works. Is that you have hundreds and thousands of gods, the more the better, right? You had with Mesopotamia, the penitential prayer to every god, where he started writing about, well, to whoever unknown and unknown god and goddess, I'm going to include them too, because I must be missing something. That was the general view. But why they had issue with Christians wasn't because of necessarily the monotheistic view in of itself, but the key was sacrifice. Sacrifice was the central outward expression of loyalty not only to the gods, but because the Roman state and religion was intertwined, then to Rome itself. To participate in rituals and festivals, to sacrifice, showed your loyalty to the Roman state, as well as to worship the Roman gods was to ensure the success of Rome. And so the idea was that if you refuse to sacrifice, if you refuse to participate in these state religious functions, you were for all purpose showing or saying, even if you weren't verbally saying it, your actions were saying you wanted Rome to fall. And that becomes problematic. It becomes problematic the instant you have it so intertwined. So state religion was much more ritualistic. You had the head priest, which were the Pontifex Maximus, and they were in charge of the religion. They were the ones that did the major they kind of managed the temples and the other priests and cults, but they were the ones that made sure that you had the rituals and sacrifices to the gods, so that the gods, were happy and that the Rome continued to be destined to be great. While the priests did this, the average person, if you were talking about having a relationship with gods, the state religion was superficial. It really was this pageantry connected to the state more than the gods themselves. Where people tended to have a relationship with the gods was with local regional gods and ancestors. This was the other. This is what would be the personal relationship with the gods. If you wanted to have a relationship with the gods, these are the gods that an average Roman focused on. Now, we'll talk the ancestors. Let's do that first. The ancestors were not like ancestor worship with China and stuff like that to that degree, but the ancestors were important. Because they were recognized as important to the family history. But also you had what were called family gods, which were not your ancestors, but the ancestors worshiped these family gods, and they had a history with that, and the family gods were your most important ones. They tended to have small statues, or statuettes is what they were usually called, and they were pretty small, and you could put them on your mantle. And these family gods were passed down from generation to generation, and they were the ones that you made sure to pray to if you had issues or concerns. You had a personal relationship with these gods. These are the gods you sacrificed to personally. These are the gods you prayed to. These are the gods that would help you out because of their connection to your ancestors. And then you also had local regional gods, which often were connected to family gods, right? The family gods tended to be regional and local gods. But this is, again, the personal relationship of the individual, where they actually had a meaningful connection to the gods, tended to be these gods, whereas the state one, which was the 12, the Greek Olympians, the known gods that if you ask someone what are the major, Greek and Roman gods, or the ones that people could name, those were way more connected to the ritualized connection of state and religion. So just keep in mind that separation, but also that the importance of sacrifice, both for Romans and later we'll see with Christianity. The Romans had gods for everything, though. So this is where they differed, and that's part because of the local and regional gods as well. They had a god for the sewers, so basically the god for poop. They had a god for meat, all different types of meats. They had a god for roads. If you could think of it, they probably had a god for it somewhere. And so the running joke was, even in Roman times, is that if you had a overly pious priest, sacrifices to the gods could go days. Because there were so many gods, Roman gods, that you couldn't keep track, and it would take forever. Okay, so that's the religion. The next thing is we're going to look at that actually spans the Punic Wars is women. So we're going to look at women in the early Republic, and then how it changes with the Punic Wars. So technically, Romans were under what was called a paterfamilia law, which is, again, right, the father family. And there's a couple different names for that. But the idea with this was that the father or husband, right, the man of the household, he had total authority over his family. And this went to, technically, he could kill family members and not be charged. Now, it was frowned upon in Roman society to kill your family members, so it wasn't something that regularly happened. Nonetheless, under paterfamilial laws, technically, the father or husband had the right to kill, and not just women, anyone, your sons, your daughters, your wife, and you had a legal right to do that. Now, this was, again, because it was a whole frowned upon to kill your family thing, it didn't happen very often. Nonetheless, it put women under, technically, some very strict laws. What's interesting about Rome is right, so this could provide strict male control. We'll say possible. And it did happen in some areas. One of the areas where you see this strict male control was with marriages. Fathers could marry off their daughter, and you had as a daughter, you had no say. So if they wanted to marry you off to some really old man because it increased their social standing, that's what you were stuck with. If your father decided that you were going to do something, or your husband, and he put down his foot and said this was the final, decision, you had no legal authority to challenge your father or husband. So the possibility of how much control that they had was problematic for women. The other thing is that, of course, some men followed it. But here's the thing that's interesting with the Roman laws with this, is that they had these laws, and then there's this level of which Romans don't follow those things. And so it just depends on the situation. The ideal woman during the early Roman Republic what definitely was connected to the myths, the pious and virtuous, right? And virtue, that was a big one, but also submissive, and this has to do with the paterfamilial laws to men, whether that's your husband or father. There's an emphasis on motherhood, as well as this connection to, well, we'll just say domestic, cleaning and cooking, right? What's important with these is that we're going to look at how it changes because of the Punic Wars. There definitely was this idea of humility and deference. We could say that's submissive to men. That these were kind of the ideal structures. Now, with this, how would happen with this is that you at the same time, what women were allowed to do. Let's see, some we'll say opportunities. We'll call it that. With what women could do. I mentioned dinner parties. Here is the interesting thing with this is that dinner parties, and these become more popular after the Punic Wars, but they still did happen in the early Republic. Here, women equally participated. Like the Greek women, they served their husbands and guests first, and they stayed with the servants and slaves and ate only once the party was over and they didn't talk or participate in it. In Roman society, women sat down at the dinner parties, they ate with the men. Here you were allowed to talk politics or really anything. It's like the dinner party was this neutral place where women were in many ways more equal. It was kind of this free for sharing kind of thing. The other thing within Rome is women were obviously allowed to go out in public, unlike in Greece. And they were allowed to interact with men. These were all things that Greek women were not allowed to do. Women were not allowed to own property. There was a big thing about not wearing jewelry as well, because the Romans saw themselves as pious, and the Romans were called, it was meant to be a slur, porridge eaters in the early Republic, because they were frugal. Well, the Romans took that as a sense of pride early on, and that will come into play of looking at the primary source, where that's kind of looked back as Rome becomes extremely wealthy. They really aren't practicing that anymore, but they still kind of hold it up to this ideal. So the idea of women wearing jewelry out in public was seen as flaunting wealth, and that wasn't a good thing. So there's a couple stories of this, the dinner parties especially, and that political freedom and ideal women and stuff like that. So you have Nero's mother, Agrippina, and then we have the story of Mark Antony's wives. And so I'll share both of these. Mark Antony had his first wife, and then his second wife was Octavia, which was Octavian's sister. So Nero's mother, she ends up marrying. So this is obviously with the empire, but these two stories showcase when women. The point of these stories with this is that it showcases going too far in politics and the ideal woman. So again, the dinner party was completely acceptable to talk about and share what you wanted. But for many, the idea was you wanted political power, you influenced your husbands, you shared with them, you went behind the scenes, or you talked during dinner parties. Women weren't allowed to be political in public. Nero's mother married Claudius, who was an emperor, and she conned and connived and convinced her way of having her son Nero, who was not Claudius's son biologically, to be named the next heir to the throne, which they weren't calling a throne because they were anti-king, but he would become the next Caesar. Rumors were that she actually poisoned Claudius. And then they pushed Benjamin, his son, aside so that Nero could become the next emperor. Nero was made emperor with Claudius's death pretty young, and she had a say in everything he did. Supposedly, when a bust of him was made, she had one of her made next to it. When he had coins made, one side of the coin was Nero, the other side of the coin was Agrippina. The final straw, and supposedly she went everywhere with him and advised him on politics. She had a special curtain made for the Senate, so when the Senate was in session and he was there, she would sit behind the curtain so she could hear what was going on. Now, everyone knew she was there, but the Romans loved their facades. As long as they couldn't see her, even though they knew she was there, then it was good. It was okay. But if they could see her, that's where the step too far happened. So what happens is one of the times in the Senate, something was said that she just couldn't stand. And so she threw open the curtain and started talking in the Senate. And that was scandalous. After that event, because she finally had become too publicly political and openly political and talking, Nero decided he had to kill his mother. He first tried to poison her, but because she probably poisoned Claudius, had been taking small amounts throughout her life, and so she became immune, and it didn't kill her. He next tried, because even an emperor, a Caesar, right, in Roman Empire, we're supposed to have, we're supposed to have some justification for killing your mother, or you make it look like an accident. It was frowned upon to just kill your mother. So the second thing he tried is, there was a lake, and she had taken her boat across to meet him at the palace. And so he claimed that her boat had a leak, and he offered her his boat, only the boat he offered her was one that was used for mock battles when they flooded the arena. And it had a collapsible bottom, so it could simulate sinking. He ordered his soldiers to go out to the middle of the lake when they returned her home and collapse the bottom and sink the ship. So they did, but it was dark and it was night, and her servant or slave freaked out and started screaming in the water, I'm Agrippina, save me. Agrippina's swimming nearby, and she hears that her slave yell that, and then she hears a thunk and then silence. Well, then she knows that the soldiers just killed her slave because they thought it was Agrippina. So she silently swims back to shore to the palace and is like, oh, son, aren't you glad to see me? Knowing full well that he just had tried to have her killed. Finally, he gave up the pretense of an accident and ordered his bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, to kill her. And they claiming that she was a traitor to Rome. Supposedly, the story goes, and whether this is true or not, but the story goes that before Nero was born, she had was given a prophecy that from her womb would come greatness and also her demise. So the greatness being Nero, right? And so when the Praetorian Guard showed up to kill her, she apparently instructed them to stab her in the womb to fulfill the prophecy. But the idea is that women in Rome were killed. This is an extreme version, but women in Rome were killed or divorced or dismissed from society for being too politically forward. A more reasonable example is Mark Antony's two wives. His first wife, she was criticized for being man in all but body. So the idea that she was manly in her behaviors and nature and everything like that. She helped Mark Antony rise up to the position he gained, which was the right-hand man to Julius Caesar. But ultimately was seen as a bad wife because she was too politically and publicly politically involved. He eventually divorces her and marries Octavia, who is Octavian's sister. Octavia gets held up as the ideal wife and woman. She not only takes over raising his children from his first marriage, as well as theirs, but Mark Antony eventually has children with Cleopatra. And when he dies, she raises his children with Cleopatra as well. When the civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony happens, Octavian tells his sister she should divorce Mark Antony now. He was the one that married her off to Mark Antony. She refuses and just says that she's going to stand by her husband. So she gets held up as being the ideal. She's loyal, she's virtuous, she's pious. She didn't get involved politically, and she raised his children, and not just her children with him, but all of his children. And that's a good example of the difference. His first wife is completely dismissed and disregarded, even though she really was a huge reason of why he ended up high in the ranks that he did politically. And then Octavia is praised because she doesn't get involved publicly with politics, but is loyal to her husband and his children, even when it would have been convenient to politically to divorce him. So that's kind of this ideal structure, and even the stories, right? The ideal woman never goes away in that process. So the Roman Republic is fundamentally going to change the role of women, as well as that whole sense of duty to Rome over the individual, as well as that concept and view of being frugal and hard worker and that type of sentiment we've been looking at with Punic Wars. So what happens with the Punic Wars is they're all against Carthage, and it has some serious consequences, positive for Rome, on what happens with that. Here. All right, so we're here. The Punic Wars start. There's 3 phases to the Punic Wars, so it's not all at once either. Just like the Peloponnesian Wars were not, but they all 3 were against Carthage. The first one happened because of what Rome felt that Carthage was encroaching on their territory, and specifically a Sicilian port that was directly across. That was directly across from the Italian mainland. And it was both for money and the argument that it provided a route for military attack, and that was threatening Rome. Rome wins. They win all of these, although they almost lose the second one. And what they have to do is Carthage has to pay massive reparations for the war, and cede Sicily to the Romans, which is what their argument of why they had the war in the first place was, because this was what should have been their territory and was encroaching on Roman territory. The next battle in the Punic Wars or period had to do in 218 because of Carthage expansion into Spain. So essentially, anytime Carthage tried to do anything, Rome decided they didn't like them. The Romans really targeted Carthage irrationally. The whole thing was they hated Carthage. And there wasn't really a strong reason for it. There were certain things that you could argue as far as threats and things like that, but they really did target that. The first war was like 20 some years, 23 years, I think. The second phase was 16 years. That actually Carthage had a magnificent general, Hannibal. Hannibal, his father, fought in the first phase of the Carthage War, and he was a brilliant tactician, and was probably their strongest military leader. He successfully snuck up basically to the gates of Rome by going through the mountain region with his army and war elephants, and through the pass, which they said no one could survive. He did suffer significant losses, but he basically surprised Rome. And if they hadn't, I mean, they mostly surprised him. If he'd fully surprised him, then he might have been successful at invading Rome itself. Unfortunately, while they were off fighting areas in Carthage, they got wind near the end that he was close to reaching Rome. Realizing that was a huge problem because most of their military was fighting Carthage and not back at Rome to defend, they made a desperate plan, which was to do an all-out assault on Carthage itself, hoping that would force Hannibal back to try to defend his city, which it did, and they ended up winning. But this was not this scared them. So it certainly probably played a role in the third phase, was just not liking Carthage, but also kind of being a little bit scared of them, of what almost happened here. The punishment this time for Carthage is that they ended up with only Carthage itself. They had to cede all territories that they had. So it simply became the city. They also had to pay more reparations as well. So more money paid to Rome. The third one, really, Carthage was not a threat. You could argue that Carthage could potentially be a threat in the first two phases. But by the third phase, you couldn't argue that. One senator would end all of his speeches, no matter what they were talking about in the Senate. It could be something that had nothing to do with war or anything else, and he'd end it with, "And Carthage must be destroyed." And that's how he ended. So, I mean, it shows the level of super intense focus on Carthage for no particular reason. And Rome, there wasn't a cause. No real cause. They just decided to attack Carthage a final time, with really the goal of utterly destroying them. That was the goal. Get rid of Carthage as much as all together. And they did. They sold most of the people into slavery once they captured them, and ended any type of possible Carthage existing and expanding from that. The consequences of this were what's most significant, because it fundamentally changed the Roman Republic, right? So the early Roman Republic is up to the Punic Wars. The later Roman Republic, which has a lot of different characteristics, is after the Punic Wars. So what comes from this is an extreme amount of land. And that was important because it created conflict between the classes again. You would think it would be beneficial to the Romans, but what happened is the wealthy, the patricians, were buying up and being gifted as well large tracts of land, thousands of acres essentially. And the plebeians, many who fought in the Punic Wars, were given land further and further away from Rome that wasn't very good. This is going to lead to conflict and fighting, and a reemergence of the class struggle much more visibly because of this disparity in wealth and benefit, for which the patricians were able to get large, massive tracts of land. This is also going to create plantation-style farming, which is going to be in tandem with the next thing on our list, which was slaves. Romans got slaves largely through military conquest. Anyone they conquered, often some of those people became slaves. Some of the Greeks were slaves. The Gauls, the people from Carthage, anywhere the Roman conquered, they made some of the conquered peoples, especially military soldiers, slaves. But the peoples as well. So you ended up having a massive amount of slaves. So much so that slaves were very cheap, to the point that almost every Roman person, almost every Roman citizen had at least one slave, because even the poor could afford at least one house slave. The wealthy, right from this, ended up with lots of slaves. And this is going to influence women, we'll see in a minute when we get to them. The other thing, of course, was the plantation-style farming. You now had a cheap and easily replaceable workforce that could work on these massive plantations that only existed because of the massive amount of land that they conquered to produce their food. And so Rome moved from that individual farmer soldier to wealthy patricians owning massive amounts of land for plantations where slaves in very harsh conditions farmed for the food for Rome. This actually is one of the things that leads, it's not the only thing, but it's one thing that helps lead to Rome's downfall, is when eventually they don't have massive influx of slaves anymore. But the slaves are still dying frequently because of the harsh conditions. But during this period, it's slaves everywhere, and so it's no big deal whether that style of farming and structure is harsh and kills off people, because they're easy and cheap to replace. And that's going to be how Rome gets fed. The city of Rome, where their food resources come from, is from this new plantation structure. But also the fact that everyone has slaves in Rome, and the wealthy have tons of slaves, not just for plantations, but for house slaves. And then it gets integrated into Roman society. There were slaves before, but nothing like what compares to the number of slaves in Rome after the Punic Wars. The next thing that leads to is extreme wealth. There is a massive uptick of wealth. Even the patricians become extremely wealthy. Everyone except for the very poor have more money. And this leads to the whole end of the whole frugal person. Even if that still is somewhat the ideal, you have now lavish and extravagant parties, dinner parties, but also besides parties, houses, clothing, jewelry. Things get extravagant. Their dinner parties get crazy. So what goes from this whole porridge eater and frugal, now you have dinner parties that last 4+ hours, sometimes even longer than that. And it became rude to stop eating. But there was so much, there would be hundreds of courses at these dinner parties for the wealthy. This wealth didn't exist like this before the Punic Wars, even for the patricians. And so there'd be hundreds of courses for these dinner parties, and it was rude to stop eating. So then what became fashionable to do is you would use a feather and you would stick it down your throat and induce vomiting so that you could keep eating. Which just showcases the extravagance and wastefulness of what the Roman Republic became. that you have so much food that you have massive dinner parties and courses, and you throw up just to keep eating, which is the exact opposite of what that ideal Roman structure was before. And then because there was so much more wealth, that wasn't just the patricians, but many plebeians who ended up businesses and gaining wealth through the Punic Wars, they ended up creating a new social class called the equestrian class. And it was named that, of course, because of the idea of being able to own a horse. That they were wealthy enough to own a horse. And so this became kind of the middle class, right? You have the patricians, the equestrians, and then the plebeians. And they're going to eventually start to play a role in the government, which is also going to cause problems later in the empire. And then lastly, women and how their roles changed. So one of the ways that it changed, oh, that's not for that area here. One of the ways that it changed is that women ended up with more freedom because their husbands were gone at war for so long, right? And while their husbands were gone at war, they were the ones managing and running the household, which meant that even though they couldn't own property, they were the ones buying and selling businesses during war. They were the ones that were kind of having the freedom, even if you have paterfamilial laws, there were no husband or father there to enforce any of that. The men being gone, right? That patriarchal control, we'll put it that way, was not present for a lot of women during the war. Gone during the war. So that allows a lot more freedom. That when the men come back, they're like, yeah, no, we're not going to go back to the way it was. You saw this in women started wearing jewelry, which was technically not allowed, and owning property, and just being more forward. Now, the other way that it changed women's roles was with slaves. Now did a lot of the work that women had done before, right? All of the household domestic work was no longer something that wealthy women did. Now, this was largely for patrician women, because while most Romans could own a slave, and having one household slave was still helpful, if you had a lot of them, I mean, it did change plebeian women too, from even having one eased up some of your job. But specifically for patricians, what you see is that women end up with a lot of free time. Because they no longer, here, we'll put that there for all of them, they no longer cooked, cleaned, raised their children. Essentially, you'd give birth, and then you'd have a slave raise them. Any other domestic structure you didn't do. Plus you had personal slaves to help dress you, bathe you, do your hair, any kind of action that you could think of. Now really slaves were there to service, and so women had a ton of free time. This meant more dinner parties because of the wealth and everything else too, but it also meant going out and socializing with women more, being more active in Roman politics. Again, though, not too publicly, but still showcasing that, and also probably being bored at times because you literally had very few responsibilities. But it definitely became more social more leisure time to engage in freedom of activities for whatever they wanted to do for the day. And then the fact that the men were gone during the war led to that type of freedom, because they had been practicing the running the business, managing money, doing what they wanted. Now, the paterfamilias were still in place, but even more kind of flouted at that point because of the Punic Wars. Okay, it's getting long, so what we'll do is we'll stop here. We'll look at this source, Plutarch's Marcus Cato the Elder, in the next lecture, along with the civil wars that lead to not only, well, with Julius Caesar and then Augustus, and the start of the empire for the next lecture, so that this one doesn't run too long. So we will be looking still at the primary source. We'll just do that in the next lecture.